Hello, and welcome to my meta review for Standard. Every week I cover best of one, best of three, and every once in a while a budget deck. And if you want to join my membership here, you can to get this video as early as Wednesday every week, as well as some other perks. Doing things like the best of three sideboard guide or break deck analysis, or things that you're doing personally, practicing for RCQs and such. Like to be a useful resource for you guys. So check that out. It might be something that appeals to you. And with that, let's get started. So this week there's no budget deck, but we can start things off with some Golgari midrange. Did quite well in the tournament. In Golgari midrange by Tizio took first place down in the Standard Challenge 32 on March 2nd. And it's been a little bit since we saw this archetype. So if we compare this, we have to go all the way back to week 8 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, largely because domain is somewhat of a problem for this list, but we've seen a decrease in the amount of domain decks on the tournament scene. So this might be a good time to play some Golgari midrange. As far as the changes to the list, we can see that Tizio decided to drop Glissa Sunslayer down from 3 copies to a single copy. Bring in 2 copies of the Preacher of the Schism, drop 1 copy of Sentinel of the Nameless City, bring in 3 copies of Tranquil Frillback, and this card has been doing particularly well. All 3 modes are applicable, I think, right now in the meta. Exiling target player's graveyard gets rid of the recurring memory deluges, as well as the kind of landfall deck in Sultai. That took down the large Standard tournament in Chicago. We've also, it's also got some artifact and enchantment hate, which is relevant against the Boros Convoke strategy. So I think this is a good time to see Tranquil Frillback back in the main, and we've seen it kind of come and go throughout the weeks. So the previous version was running the Blossoming Tortoise and doing some of the Manland synergies. We're dropping the 3 copies of the Blossoming Tortoise, and that one works particularly well against Control. So I know that like Azorius Control is in the meta. So I was actually kind of curious to see that one being considered dropped. Bringing in 2 copies of Sheoldred the Apocalypse, 1 copy of Akhlazot's Deepest Betrayal, and ditching the 1 Sorin the Mirthless, and bringing in an additional copy of Cutdown, ditching the Anoints with Affliction, and bringing in a 4th copy of Go for the Throat. Cutting the 2 copies of Virtue of Persistence, and running 2 Gix's Command, which works particularly well against the Boros Convoke strategy, being able to wrath their board. And then we're cutting Argoth, Sanctum of Nature, because we're not doing the land stuff. We're cutting out the 2 copies of Mishra's Foundry, and we're bringing in a Forest, as well as 2 Underground Mortuaries, which are the Surveil lands that we got in Murders at Karlov Manor. As far as the sideboard goes, we have no Titania, Voice of Gaia, because we're not doing the Argoth, Sanctum of Nature. We've taken out the 2 copies of Tranquil Frillback because they are in the main. We've brought in 1 Long Goodbye, which has been an exploration because the spell can't be countered. But you have to hit something that's 3 or less. But I think this is often something that could be explored over like a Go for the Throat. We've got 2 Pilfers, which is kind of like Duress, but a little bit 1 more expensive, but a little bit of hand hate. And I think that the plan here is to bring in the 3 copies of Duress as well as the 2 copies of Pilfer against the Azorius Control matchup. We're not running Breach the Multiverse. We're not running Cutdown in the sideboard, so no 4th copy of Cutdown. And we're not running a Gix's Command in the sideboard because we brought it into the main. And then we've got a Path of Peril, or eliminating the board strategies of like Boros Convoke, and we're ditching the Phyrexian Arena as well as the Tear Asunder. And instead, we are bringing in 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse for a little bit of graveyard hate. Mentioned the graveyard hate is relevant in some matchups. Nightclubber for a little bit of a -1/-1 against like the token stacks, Boros Convoke. And then we've got 1 copy of The End, which is particularly good against Azorius Control, being able to eliminate their win conditions. And then 1 copy of Nissa, Ascended Animist, which allows us to give a trample +1. sometimes the sideboard thing drives me nuts. Okay, gives us a +1/+1 and trample to all of our creatures. It is a good way to get over other mid-range decks. So if you're curious about the cards and why they're being brought out and brought in, one of the things that I do every Friday is a best of 3 sideboard guide. So that one's going to be on the poll this week. Or so if you're interested in Golgari midrange and kind of its matchups and what's the top performing card and such, be sure to remember to vote for the best of 3 sideboard guide. All right, second place was taken down by Esper Midrange by Kadrip. And if we compare this to week 3 of Murders at Karlov Manor, so 2 weeks ago, I think Ariane's list, if I remember correctly, we can see that there have been a couple of changes. So Go for the Throat up to 4, No More Lies up to 3 instead of just 2 copies, kind of confirming that No More Lies does actually fit in the Esper midrange strategy. Virtue of Loyalty up to 3 copies, because I think we've seen a decrease in enchantment hate, and taking out 1 copy of the Gix's Command. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've cut 1 copy of the Lorn of the Third Path, so just 1 there. 1 Disdainful Stroke, 2 down 2 Cryptic Coats, which is also good against the Azorius control matchup. Bringing in 1 more copy of Temporary Lockdown, so we can bring in 3 copies against Boros Convoke or the other go wide strategies. We're cutting out the 2 copies of Kaido Shizuki and up 1 cut down, and bringing in 3 Destroy Evils or against Esper Midrange and against Boros Convoke. Both have decent enchantment targets, as well as hitting Rafine in the mirror match. And then Tishana's Tidebinder, a 1 of here, which is also good against the Boros Convoke strategy. And then third place was taken down by another Golgari midrange, this one by Joao Claudiomes. Probably massacring that name. I tried. Anyway, if we compare this to week 8 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we can see that they decided to drop Mosswood Dreadknight down 1 copy to 3. Similarly, they dropped 2 copies of Glissa Sunslayer, but kept 1 copy. Brought in 2 copies of the Preacher of the Schism, which works pretty nice. I've been impressed with Preacher of the Schism. I think it's a nice card. Taking out 1 Sentinel of the Nameless City down to 4 copies here. And then also ditching the Blossoming Tortoise strategy and bringing in the 3 copies of the Tranquil Frillback. And but we've also got 2 copies of Archfiend of the Dross. And ditching the Sorin and Nissa as far as the Planeswalkers goes, bringing Cut Down up to 3, bringing in 1 copy of Bitter Triumph, taking out the 2 copies of Virtue of Persistence, as well as the 2 Anoint with Afflictions, bringing in 3 copies of Gix's Command to really counter Boros Convoke, I believe. Similarly, ditching Argoth, Sanctum of Nature, and Mishra's Foundry, since we're not doing the land loops, dropping 1 copy of the Restless Cottage from 4 to 3, and bringing in 4 copies of the new Surveil Land Underground Mortuary. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've also seen, ditching the Titania Voice of Gaia, since we don't have the Argoth to kind of combo with that. And that was kind of a 1 of anyway. Ditching 2 copies of Tranquil Frillback and bringing them in the main. Ditching 1 copy of Anoint with Affliction, as well as Breach the Multiverse. Bringing the Duress count up to 4 to really counter the Azorius control matchup. Taking out 1 Gix's Command because we brought it into the main. 2 Path of Perils in this list instead of just 1. And taking out the Phyrexian Arena and the Terra Senders. Bringing in Liliana of the Veil as a sideboard option, as well as 2 The Inns for some Azorius control hate, and then 3 copies of Nissa Ascended Animist. So a little bit more of a, not covering as many matchups, a little bit more focused for specific hate in the sideboard. And then perhaps unsurprisingly, we have the counter to the Golgari coming in the next day for first place in the Standard Challenge 64 on March 3rd. So maybe the moment for Golgari to shine has already come and gone. Who knows? But if we compare this to week 3 of Murders at Karlov Manor, we can see that they've ditched the 4 copies of the Trumpeting Carnosaur and bringing in one copy of Imidane's Recruiter, which was kind of fun. This can allow you to give like your herd migrations haste all in one turn, and as well as just like allows you to create a bigger board before you do the haste thing. Like I'm curious to see how Imidane's Recruiter fits into Domain. That was a fun inclusion. We're back on the 4 copies of Invasion of Zendikar. They were cut out because the Trumpeting Carnosaur really hates to hit an Invasion of Zendikar off of the Discover. So we're bringing all 4 of those copies back in. The Virtue of Persistence were down 2 copies there, bringing in 2 copies of Spelunking instead, which has some cave synergies, but allows you to just kind of ramp. And so there's no cave synergies in here except for the even Cavern's not a cave. So not really leaning into the gaining 4 life, but allows you to kind of ramp a little bit faster. So curious to see how that one plays out. And as far as, let's see, Nissa Ascended Animist is taken out of the main, and then the lands, we've ditched 1 mountain to bring in 1 plains, cut the 2 copies of the Rafine's Tower, and brought in 2 Spara's Headquarters. So as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've definitely seen a rework to this one as well. So, and this is largely, I think, why the plains was brought in, was as the very white sideboard. But for the best of 3 sideboard, we're ditching the Chromho Seed Sharks, Melira the Living Cure, which was Bant Toxic or Bant Poison, has kind of dropped in popularity. Ditched the 1 copy of Obstinate Baloth because Lily hasn't been very common. Ditched the 2 copies of Tranquil Frillback, which I thought maybe that one should be still kept in there. But we've got Kutzil's Flanker, which allows us to exile target player's graveyard. So I think that's the kind of alternative exploration for graveyard hate. We're ditching the 1 copy of Abrade, ditching the 4 copies of Knockout Blow, just because mono red has been less prevalent. Taking out 2 copies of Lithomantic Barrage, and bringing in 1 copy of Negate, up to a total of 3 to fight other domain decks as well as other Azorius control decks. The Destroy Evil, as I mentioned, works really well against Esper Midrange and Boros Convoke. And then the 3 copies of Kutzil Flanker helps with if you do bump into the Sultai landfall deck, or whatever you want to call it, the one that's running the Slogurk, but it has yet to take a top 3 space in the standard challenge, so I haven't covered it yet. And then we've got 4 copies of Temporary Lockdown to really answer Boros Convoke, as well as 3 copies of Wandering Emperor. All right, next up, it was second place was taken down by Boros Convoke by JP Stash. And if we compare this one to this is the first Boros Convoke list that has top 3'd a standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. And so I don't really have a deck that's easily to compare it to other than the one by Satoshi Nakayama in Japan, all the way back on February 11th. So let's see so they've decided to bring in 2 copies of Lunarch Veteran, ditch the 2 copies of the Ocean Frontliner, and bring in 2 more copies of the Resolute Reinforcements for a total of 4. 2 copies of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, which if you go and watch my ultimate nerd guide to Boros Convoke, I mentioned Thalia as a decent option. And so happy to see that one in there. Sanguine Evangelist, which was missing from the list, so bringing in 2 copies there. And taking out the 4 copies of Kumano Faces Kakazan. Hasn't worked particularly well in the archetype, as well as taking out the 2 copies of Warleader's Call, which was good against the more slow controlling matchups, if I remember correctly. So this one's just leaning a little bit more into just threats over a grindier strategy against domain or against board wipes. And then we're bringing in, as far as the lands go, we've got 2 Cavern of Souls, which I thought was kind of fun because that allows you to like make it so that they can't counter your Imidane's Recruiter, your Knight Errant of Eos. So I like that addition. And bringing in 1 copy of Mirix, and taking out 2 mountains and 2 plains for 1 Thran Portal. And as far as the lands go, I think the biggest thing to figure out is like, are you going to run 4 copies of Thran Portal, or are you going to try to like, mix it up a little bit there? So I think as far as like where we're going to see improvement with the deck is in whether or not to include copies of Thran Portal. But this is very close to the deck that was run by Darkest Stream over at MTG Rebellion, who also does a meta review every Wednesday, I believe. So if you haven't checked them out already, I highly recommend them. I enjoy watching their show quite a bit. And Yeah, they took down a pizza box tournament with a deck that was very close to this one. So I think we're getting close to like a fully optimized list in Boros Convoke. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we can see they've ditched the 2 copies with Play of Fire, which felt a little out of place, the Surge of Salvation, Yotian Frontliner, so no Yotian Frontliner in the sideboard as well, no Citizen's Crowbar, which I can get behind. Those were all kind of like exploration sideboards anyway. We're bringing in 2 copies of Lithomanic Barrage, which is particularly good against white and blue decks. Bringing in 1 Sun Gold. Where's the Sun? Yeah, Sun Gold Sentinel. But I thought this one was kind of fun. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. So this gives us that little bit of graveyard hate against the Slogurk deck, right? And like Coven. I don't know. I think I like the Flanker more than the Sun Gold Sentinel. But I think that was the logic behind that inclusion. And then we've got 2 more copies of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, which is a really great way to hate on the spell-heavy lists, and is good against Azorius Control. We took out the 2 copies of Invasion of Gobekon. That one works with better the more depopulates and such that you're playing around. And we're bringing in 2 copies of the Anointed Peacekeeper, which I really like because it basically does the same thing as Invasion of Gobekon, but like it's a human and puts a body on the board. So I can get behind that suggestion. We're exploring 1 Brutal Cathar, and I do remember this one coming up briefly as one of the top performing cards in the archetype when I did the data analysis. And so I don't remember if there was one specifically that Brutal Cathar was really good against off the top of my head. So I'm not exactly sure which matchup they're bringing in the Brutal Cathar for. If you know, let me know in the comments below. That would be helpful. We're ditching the 3 copies of Witchstalker's Frenzy and bringing in 1 copy of Godric, which was another one that was kind of like a, okay, interesting sideboard option, and bringing in 2 copies of Lauren of the Third Path, or I imagine the Mirror Match, being able to destroy their enchantments. So again, if you want a more detailed breakdown of what each of the cards is best at in which decks, I hopefully my best of 3 sideboard guide scratches that itch. All right, and then 3rd place was taken down by Lucas Giggs with a domain list as well. And so they're ditching the 4 copies of the Trumpeting Carnosaur and taking out the Nissa from the main, bringing in 1 copy of the Wandering Emperor, which we've seen kind of come and go throughout the weeks. Some lists like to keep the Wandering Emperor in the main. We're bringing in Invasion of Zendikar, but only 2 copies, which I thought was kind of unique. Usually you see 3 or 4, and so settling just here on 2. Bringing in 1 copy of Depopulate, which we've seen as a relatively common inclusion in the domain lists. And we're dropping the Up the Beanstalk down 1 and taking out the Virtue of Persistence and favoring 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown for Boros Convoke and Bant Toxic, tweaking of Forest up 1 and Plains up 1, while dropping the Rafine's Tower and bringing in 2 Spara's Headquarters. Now, so that's a total of 28 lands if I counted it correctly. So maybe that's why they didn't want to do the Invasion of Zendikar, is that they wanted to play the lands over it. So it was kind of an ultra high land count. And, this deck cannot afford to stumble on land draws, so maybe that was part of it too. Notably, the sideboard is only 12 cards, so maybe they just ran out of time. But yeah, we ditched the 1 copy of Malira the Living Cure, as well as the 2 copies of Knockout Blow and 2 copies of Negate. Otherwise, the sideboard is the same. Brought in 1 more additional copy of Temporary Lockdown so that we can play a total of 3, and brought in 1 Nissa Ascended Animist in the sideboard. All right, I also like to cover best of 3 or best of 1. So if best of 3 is not your jam and you just want to climb up that ladder, I can highly recommend Boros Convoke and Mono Red. They have been performing very well with the best of 1 Hand Smoother especially. So number 1, according to Untapped, which is a tracker that tracks Magic the Gathering data, goes to Boros Convoke this week, overtaking Mono Red aggro. And if we compare this to the list that I covered in week 4 of Murders at Karlov Manor, so last week, there are some changes. So we're bringing in the 2 copies of the Lunarch Veteran, which also matches what we've seen in best of 3, ditching the Yotian Frontliner, 1 copy, as well as ditching the 1 copy of Stoke the Flames, which the Stoke the Flames, the only matchup that I can remember off the top of my head that Stoke the Flames is favorable in is against Domain. And so in best of one, you're not going to see a lot of Domain. And so I think it kind of makes sense to ditch the Stoke the Flames. We're bringing in one more mountain here and cutting one Battlefield Forge, taking out 2 Sundown Pass, which was good because the one last week had 4 copies, and I think that's too high. But we're running the 4 copies of the Thran Portal. So, it comes with a price. But personally, when I have played the Boros Convoke lists, I have not been upset with the Thran Portal. Now, some things I would like to remark on just really quickly is that there is no case of the Gateway Express, and there is a War Leader's Call, which is kind of the opposite of what we're seeing in Best of 3. So and also part of my Ultimate Nerd Guide was talking about the advantages of being able to have both in your Best of 3 deck lists, right? So it's very matchup dependent about whether or not you should include which one over the other, right? So if you ditch the War Leader's Call for your Case of the Gateway Express, that's fine. You're going to be better off against some matchups, worse off against others. I think the reason why this one is doing well in the data is because Azorius Control has been my most common matchup on the ladder. So it depends on where you are on the ladder. But War Leader's Call is a good thing to have against the control matchups and against Domain. So if you need, kind of keep that in mind with what you are personally facing. If you're coming up against a lot of mono red, for example, you don't want the War Leader's Call, and that's why I do those matchup analysis every week. So then number 2, according to the tracker, is mono red aggro. It's the same list as I covered in week 3 2 weeks ago in Murders at Karlov Manor. Celestia Enchantments is number 3. And that's the same list as the list that I covered in week 2. So it's the one with no brushlands and no rare lands. So no Iganjo, no Boseiju. Just going straightforward there that way. Number 4, which we saw number 5 last week, I think, if I remember correctly, into number 4 this week, is Jeskai Control. And this one's different than the one that I'm running for the 50 match summary that you can watch on Saturday and or yesterday, depending on when you're watching this video. But so if we compare this to the one that I covered last week, we can see that we've ditched the Zurgo and Ojutai, which I can get behind because that card, it's good, but at the same time, if they counter it, it's not so good, right? So it depends on if you're coming up against other control matchups. And this one is favoring instead going into the Wandering Emperor and Jace, which I think is a much better or more consistent win condition against the other control decks. Is joining and trying to mill everybody out. Dropping 1 copy of the March of Otherworld Light, dropping the 4 copies of Get Lost, as well as the 2 copies of Dissipate and the 1 copy of Temporary Lockdown. And instead, we're running an additional copy of Celestus, an additional copy of Sunfall, and Teferi, Who Slows the Sunset, has been cut, or 3 more copies of Wandering Emperor and 4 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind. And I think you should just take this, right? I mean, this has performed well, and in Azorius Control, I think it performs better, certainly, than the Zurgo and Ojutai. See here, we're also bringing in 2 copies of Soul Partition, which allows us to bounce something and then make it cost 2 more and delay their hand. Bringing in 1 copy of Negate, which I like because I have been bumping into a lot of control. As far as the lands go, the Battlefield Forge all the way up to 4 copies. We've cut 2 copies of the Deserted Beach. Bing! Okay, so bringing that one down to 2. Restless Anchorage all the way down to 1. And cutting the Iganjo from the list, as well as 2 copies of the Elegant Parlor, and bringing in Shivan Reef up to 3, so bringing in 2 more copies there. Storm Carved Coast, we're going down 2 copies on. And there's so many lands, it's hard to find, sorry. Bringing down Storm Carved Coast to a total of 2. And cutting the Thundering Falls, bringing in 1 mountain and 3 copies of the Sea Chrome Coast, which is the fast land for Azorius, and bringing in 1 Restless Spire. So this is nice because it gives us having 1 of each basic if we are coming up against Field of Ruin. So then afterwards, number 5, we've got Azorius Control is sitting at number 5. That one is the same list as the one that I covered in week 2. Mono Blue Tempo, which is the budget list that I did the 50 match summary on. That's the same list as I covered in week 3. Orsov Life Gain is number 7, same list as I covered in week 2 and did the 50 match summary for. Mono Black Aggro is number 8, and that one is same list as I covered in week 3, so 2 weeks ago. And Golgari Midrange, I expect to see a spike in it because it did do well in the standard challenge, but the current data that I have is insufficient, right? None of them have been played up to 1,000 matches. Mono White Humans is the same list as I covered in week 3 of Murders at Karlov Manor, and this is why I like to cover best of 3 first, is because like best of 1 there's like some repetition where it's kind of like, all right, well, this is figured out. But I do like to extend things, so this is a little bit of an off meta, right? I know that the title of my show is best decks in standard, but hopefully I have given you enough throughout the week so that we can do a little bit of off meta exploration. So one of the ones that I'd like to talk about is Esper Control, and similar to Jeskai Control, I do think that the control meta definitely has a space in the current Murders at Karlov Manor standard experience. So if we compare this one to week 4 of Murders of Karlov Manor, the best of 3 list, we can see that this one has some similarities, but like not 100%. And what you're expecting as a control deck to match up against in best of 3 is not what you're expecting to match up against in best of 1. They usually have diverse metas. There's a little bit of overlap because we do see Boros Convoke in best of 1 and in best of 3. But if you're, a control mage and you're trying to develop your own strategy, keep that in mind, that the data is important of which one you're looking at. And so we're ditching the 2 copies of Doorkeeper Thrall. I think we should see Doorkeeper Thrall make it into a list with how popular Boros Convoke is and how good Doorkeeper Thrall is at shutting that down. But we're bringing out 2 copies of the Wandering Emperor, bringing in 2 copies of Kaido Shizuki. If you go back and look at the Dimir mid-range, you can kind of look at like what matchups this was good at. Off the top of my head, I remember Boros Convoke in Mono Red. We're taking out the Kaya Intangible Slayer for 2 copies of Kaya Spirit's Justice, which is the new Planeswalker that we got in Murders at Karlov Manor. And this one can do some silly stuff, especially with tokens off of Kaido Shizuki. There's some like token synergies with this card specifically. We're cutting out the 2 copies of Cutdown entirely. It's getting rid of that card. And then taking out the 4 copies of Deduce, as well as 2 copies of Go for the Throat. So still leaving 1 behind here. Taking the No More Lies down to 3 from 4. And bringing in 1 more copy of Temporary Lockdown, which I can get behind. I think especially in best of 1, there's enough that like you can justify this. It sucks when you're up against Azorius Control, and this is kind of a dead card though. Void Rend, we've got 3 copies of Void Rend here instead of 2. Memory Deluge going from 4 to 3, and taking out the 2 copies of Sunfall, so just down to 1, which is what we saw in the Jeskai list. You can make control work with just the 1 Sunfall. And then we're bringing in 2 copies of the Sunset Revelry, which works particularly well against the aggro strategies and the go wide strategies. And then we're bringing in 3 copies of the Deadly Cover-Up, which works nicely against the Azorius control deck, as well as being a Wrath that helps you with the board. I think we're going to see more of this card as time goes on. Just because like the End and Deadly Cover-Up both allow you to just attack certain strategies within your opponent's deck and hand. And then we've got 1 more, bringing in 1 copy of March of Otherworldly Light. I like this one particularly to snipe the artifact that is being sacked for Gleeful Demolition. You can do some really cool stuff with the March of Otherworldly Lights. I actually liked running 4 in the Jeskai control deck that I just showcased. It's been good so far. 2 copies of Get Lost for a little bit of targeted removal, and 3 copies of the Outrageous Robbery, which gives us an alternative way to kind of win against instead of Jace, we can do Outrageous Robbery to an extent, and that allows us to mill our opponent as a potential win con, but also just gives us a huge card advantage, right? If our opponent doesn't counter this, then you can draw a ton of cards out of Outrageous Robbery and kind of do like a Brain Geyser. And then we've got 1 more bringing in 1 copy of the Celestis to give us some life gain as well as some filtering. And then the lands, there's quite a bit going on with the lands, right? When you're playing Jeskai and Esper, part of what you got to figure out is how to make the lands work. So this one we've got -3 on the Dark Slick Shores. It's like the order of it is never in the same order, right? It's always annoying. Yeah, okay, so cutting all of the copies of the Dark Slick Shores and taking out the 2 Deserted Beaches, bringing that one from 4 to 2, and then cutting 1 island, so no basic, bringing in 2 copies of Mirix, which is good against the Azorius control matchup, cutting 1 Restless Anchorage, so no Restless Land. Yeah, cutting the Restless Anchorage from the list, taking out the Seachrome Coast, which I think was a 1 of as well. Yep. And then bringing out 1 Swamp and 1 Underground River. Yeah. So if you don't know what those are, I'm sorry, you can look them up. As far as what we're bringing in, though, we've got Takenuma, Abandoned Mire, which allows us to bring back a creature or planeswalker, which works really nicely with our Kaido and our Kaido Shizuki and our Kaya and our Wandering Emperor. So I like the Takenuma inclusion there. Bringing in 2 Meticulous Archives, which is the new Surveil land for Azorius, and bringing in 2 Caves of Kolios, which is the Pain land for Orsov, bringing in 2 Shadowy Backstreets, which is another Surveil land, this time for Orsov, and then 2 Undercity Sewers, which is also the Surveil land, this time for Dimir. Okay, this is another one that's kind of off the beaten path, so play this one in best of 1 with an asterisk, right? But if we compare this one to week 4 of Murders at Karlov Manor, the best of 3 list, then we can see that there have been a couple of changes. So one is dropping a Fairy Mastermind from 3 copies down to 2, dropping Dinnik from 3 copies down to 2, bringing in 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder, bringing in 1 Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, so a total of 2 now, bringing in 3 copies of Make Disappear, and one additional copy of Go for the Throat, so bringing up to a total of 4. Ditching the Destroy Evils. You hardly ever come up against Esper midrange in best of 1. So that, Destroy Evil is a little bit better in best of 3. Ditching the 2 copies of No More Lies. Now, time will tell if that is actually a good decision or not. It took a while for it to enter into the list in best of 3. It has looked like it's going to be there to stay, though. And so with time, it'll be interesting to see if the best of 1 tends to lag a little bit behind best of 3 on the tournament scene, which is why I like to cover the tournament scene. So we'll see if later No More Lies comes into play here. Ditching 1 copy of Gix's Command, as well as 1 Swamp, and bringing in a Underground River. All right. And that's right, we got 3 off-meta picks this week. Let's go. So the other one that I'd like to end here, I looked at a couple of other ones as well. Bant Toxic, for example, same list as the one I covered in week 4. Dimir midrange is like Golgari midrange, doesn't have enough data on the tracker to really cover yet. Similarly, Boros Control is an archetype that we will eventually cover later into the format, hopefully. But that one was also not popular enough. And same with Rakdos midrange. So not covering those quite yet. But Boros Humans had a list that had enough, and this one I wanted to talk about a little bit because my research into the Boros Convoke strategy kind of led me to believe that the Gleeful Demolition and Voldarian Epicure were not that necessary. And so my list was basically mono white with Imidane's Recruiter. I was deciding to run Warleader's Call, but that was largely because I was in best of 3 and wanted to be able to play against the control matchups. So I kind of like where this is going because we know that like mono white is a really good counter to mono red, and it being able to just like the splash is relatively free since everything is already human and works really well with the Secluded Courtyard and the Cavern of Souls. So like we have pretty good fixing for creature spells in red. So the Imidane's Recruiter is almost free, right? So like this is kind of like mono white humans as well, and so I'd be curious to see how this one performs on the ladder. the data suggests that it's definitely viable. It's definitely not a super popular pick because most people are just playing the Boros Convoke strategy over it. But I think there's something to it. I think that this might actually, if Boros Convoke hasn't really been working for you, or if you want to like think about what's the weakest card in your Boros Convoke list, I recommend playing this Boros Humans list and just seeing how like the mono white cards I think are really where the power lies, as I mentioned in my Ultimate Nerd episode. So I ship this. I think there's something to the Boros Humans just splashing red for Imidane's Recruiter, but maybe not. To each their own. So remember to hit like and subscribe, and thanks for listening to my ramblings. I really do enjoy doing this every week because it just I love to see the innovation that is happening in Best of 3 and then how it translates over time into Best of 1. If you have anything that if you have an archetype that you'd really like covered, let me know in the comments below. And once again, I'm just gonna plug the idea of, if you want to help support me, one of the best ways to do that is by joining as a YouTube member, and that way you get my YouTube videos at an earlier time. And I'm trying to make it an enticing endeavor, because at the moment I have one YouTube member. So if you do enjoy these every week, please help. Please at least consider helping support me in this endeavor. And but if not, I understand. Money's tight, man, and I appreciate you guys just listening to me in the first place. So I always feel a little bit awkward doing self plugs, but with that, good luck with your matches. Good luck, and good luck with your RCQs if you're competing there. Let me know how things are going. I love hearing about your RCQ matchups, and good luck on the ladder. And maybe I'll see you there.